Some Christians see loyalty to America as central to our faith and our identity, but other Christians are more skeptical that our nation should not warrant such devotion. Is there a way between Christian nationalism, as so many people are talking about, and national cynicism on the other side? This is Grassroots Conversations, and my name is Jeff Holsclaw. As always, this is coming to you from Grassroots Christianity, which is seeking to grow faith for everyday people. So glad to have Dr. Richard Mouw on with us today. He has served as the president of Fuller Theological Seminary for about 20 years, was also the director of the Institute of Faith and Public Life that was hosted there. And he is currently the senior research fellow at the Henry Institute for the Study of Religion and Politics at Calvin University. It used to be Calvin College, but now it's a university. He is the author of numerous books, and most recently, he has written a book called How to Be a Patriotic Christian, Love of Country as Love of Neighbor. Dr. Mouw, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Yes, well, when you started writing this book a couple years ago, you probably didn't know just how much of a national conversation maybe this was turning into. But you wrote did you or did you not?
Well, it was certainly heating up, but
Yeah.
it's gotten a lot hotter since. Yeah.
For sure. Well, you chose the theme of patriotism, and you mentioned why right at the beginning. Why are you talking about Christian patriotism, or how Christians can be patriotic? Why did that come to you as something that we needed to speak about?
Well, I think the very word patriotism is not a popular one in many ways. And people who are patriotic are often viewed by other people as idolatrous, as making something like a god out of the nation, or giving complete uncritical support to the nation. And yet, I really think that there's something good about patriotism. It's simply loving one's country,
Hmm.
and it's okay to love one's country. Love one's country better than one loves other countries. Although certainly we need to have a kind of cosmic sense of the rule of God, and there are many nations and tribes that are part of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. But I think the love of country is a good thing, and it ought to be encouraged, the right kind of love for country.
The right kind of love for country. And your subtitle, and I know authors don't always have control over titles and subtitles, but the subtitle of your book is Love of Country as Love of Neighbor. So just as a real high level, how do those two things fit together? You say that it's not a sin or it's not wrong to love your country, but how does that also, the love of neighbor, which of course for Christians is, one of the dual love commands?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, there's a profound sense in which every human being is my neighbor. But the fact is, I don't know every human being. I know a very specific community. And when we hear the call to love our neighbors, it's typically a call to love people with whom we have some kind of relationship, whether we live in the same area, or we go to the same ball games, or we watch the same parades, or we shop in the same stores. And that sense of where we are is very important. I was talking to a person a while back who just really disagreed with me. He said, you don't just love your own country. You've got to love every country equally, and you cannot show partiality. The interesting thing, Jeff, is he was wearing a Dodger shirt. And when it came to loving every team in the National League or the American League equally, he really did not buy into that at all. And what that illustrates is it's okay. It's okay to root for the team of the school that you attended. It's okay to care about the well-being of the town in which you live. And even more specifically, it's okay to care about your parents uh, more than you care about other people's parents, although there has to be a kind of love of neighbor that applies there as well.
Sure. So, and I think that that last statement, is really easy to kind of feel, right? So you love your parents, God, tells us in the Old and New Testament you're supposed to honor your parents, take care of them, especially when they're old, right? So it's impossible to give the same level of care to everyone's parents as you,
Mm, mm,
you just can't do that, but you're called to take care of your own parents. But then the question is, well, how does that apply to the fatherland, right? If we're going to use that
Yeah,
kind of language, is how do we love the fatherland? But really quick, just to be honest, back to the Dodgers fan, because I was raised in the Bay Area, so I'm a Giants fan.
yeah,
And then I lived in Chicago. I'm also a Cubs fan, so I'm pretty against the Dodgers, just outright,
yeah,
just outright.
yeah, yeah. Well,
But I know you've been a long time Los Angeles, Pasadena resident, so I don't know where your loyalties lie there, but
I grew up in New Jersey, and in those days there were the Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Giants, the New York Yankees, and the
okay.
games were televised. The local games were televised regularly, and I was an ardent Brooklyn Dodgers fan, and I always resented the fact that they moved to Los Angeles. So it did not transfer on to the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Really? So your loyalty stuck with the old Dodgers and not the new Dodgers?
Yeah, and sort of with the Mets today, but I've always had an anti-Yankee bias. But I've got to say, my son and my grandsons, my daughter-in-law, are all ardent Yankee fans, and
Oh,
so
rats.
I've
Well,
had to juggle my love for them with my lack of love for the team that they love. Although
well, okay.
I
So
hope
this
Aaron Judge hits his couple home runs yet.
That's yeah, well, okay. Well, we're getting really in the weeds of the baseball, which I love.
Yeah,
But so you love your children, you love your baseball team, but all those loves don't align, right? So this is happening quite regularly when it comes to politics and these types of things. And you mentioned in your book how there's these ceremonial activities and they happen quite often at sporting events. So like baseball, if I'm
yeah,
watching the Cubs or the Dodgers, right? So we stand and we sing the national anthem,
yeah.
and these different kinds of things happen, and Christians have different opinions about how to engage in those activities. And so you kind of bring this up a little bit in your book. You just want to kind of go through like what are those things doing, and how might Christians think about participating or not participating in those activities?
Well, yeah, I think that the many of the activities that we associate with patriotism, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance, standing with hand over heart for the national anthem, watching parades where they go by with the American flag and all the rest. To me, these are very important functions because there's something about being a part of a nation, a community of people that is absolutely necessary to have a kind of an affection for what it is that holds us together. I say in the book that before I started writing, I actually went and read through and meditated on all of the patriotic songs that I,
Mhm.
you know, and I found that those songs really basically focus on three things. You get a lot of natural wonders, purple mountain majesties and fruited plains and rocks and rills. And that is a great part of what we love about our country. Spaces, Yosemite and you know Yellowstone and the like. Uh,
Sure.
and secondly, stories of the past. And of course, the Star Spangled Banner is a story. It tells briefly a story about the past. Our flag was still there in the morning, and there's something inspiring about that. Not all the stories about our past are good. We need to pay attention to the bad ones as well, but there are good stories about the past. And then, thirdly, ideals, freedom, law, liberty and law, and the like. And when we pledge allegiance to the flag or we stand before at a ball game, we're really concentrating on those things. I make this very important distinction between a nation and a state. And we've seen this recently in the British setting. The head of the nation is the Queen, was the Queen, and the head of the state was the Prime Minister. Prime Minister stands in front of the members of Parliament and they yell at them. And, there's a lot of give and take there. But when you're in the presence of the Queen, you're in the presence of someone who, in a sense, symbolizes what holds us together as a people. And that's not a bad thing. And we, of course, we don't have kings and queens. We have the White House and presidents that sort of mix the functions of state and nation. But there's something about needing to be devoted to our peoplehood, what binds us together, that is very important. And standing at ball games, and I've done that at Dodger. I actually go to Dodger Stadium, and I've looked down the row. I've got my hand over my heart, and the Muslim woman has a hand over her heart, and the Latino folks, and the Middle Eastern ones, and African Americans. We probably all vote in different ways. We care about different policies. But the fact is that there's something that binds us together. And the fact is we're losing a lot of that. And the partisanship that we're experiencing right now, we're losing some of that. That's a bad thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so there's this loss of the peoplehood, of being a part of we the people.
Yeah.
In that sense, could you fill out a little bit more just for the, because you say the difference between a nation and state. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But could you fill that out for people who don't normally think that way? What is the difference between talking about like a national peoplehood and this thing that we call a state or politics or the government or something like that?
Right. Well, the peoplehood is say in the United States, it's a vast territory of people who are bound together not by how they vote, because they vote different ways, not about what they like or dislike about government, but simply because we have a common heritage, we have our common songs that we sing, we have common rituals. Parades are a very important part of all of this. There's a sense of being held together as a people. And then we have these ceremonial occasions, like presidential inaugurations, for example, where the emphasis is not on partisanship. Robert Bellah, the sociologist, analyzed, talking about civil religion, analyzed John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, And John F. Kennedy says, I stand before you and I'm making solemn vows before God and you. And then in the middle, he mentions God again. And in the end, he says that we need to make sure that our work is God's work. We're not asking God to work for us. We're asking ourselves to work for God. Well, these ceremonial occasions are when people are together. And but the state is very different, I mean, when you say you love America, there are very few people who, when they say they love America, the United States, are thinking how much they love the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Zoning Commission. They're talking about ideals. They're talking about less business type things, but they're talking about stories of the past that bind us together and the like. And when you see these wonderful photos of people who have just become citizens of the United States, they're excited, again, not by now having access to the Department of Motor Vehicles, but by having access to a heritage, to that which binds human beings together over a vast territory. And that's a very important distinction, Jeff, I think, between the state and the nation.
Yeah. And so like national pride, when we think first responders, when we
Yeah.
think of natural disasters, there's a sense of national compassion, solidarity, and that's the kind of the peoplehood that is expressed there. And then the state is, that's the politics, everyday politics, and it's confusing, like you said, and you mentioned throughout the book, it's difficult because, especially in America, the figurehead of the president is not just a figurehead, but is also a politician. And so you have kind of the national passions of the peoplehood who either feel like, things are going well or things are going poorly. Those affections are directed toward the president, but then there's also the politics or the economics, and the voting in and out. And so those things do kind of get conflated. And so you're trying to show like, well, these things are a little bit different. Some people would say too, though, like Colin Kaepernick 4 or 5 years ago, he would kneel during the national anthem as kind of a protest that we were not living up to our national ideals. And people took that a bunch of different ways. They took it very much like this is a state political action. This is, an attack on our peoplehood. Right. And then there's other things that you mentioned, like Confederate monuments and things. So these things that constitute our peoplehood are also contested. Like they're not just
Absolutely right.
agreed upon.
No, and that's a good thing to talk about. I mean, I'm a product of the 1960s. I protested against the Vietnam War. I marched for civil rights, and I had a lot of trouble. I mean, there was a big generational thing where the older generation of my kind of Christians saw me as a kind of traitor. And, I can still remember people when marching for civil rights, America, love it or leave it, And
Yeah, that's still going on.
yeah. And yet at the same time, a debate over our ideals. The whole question, we have Thanksgiving coming up. I think it's a good thing to talk about. What's the first thing Thanksgiving all about, and how have we kind of romanticized it and cleansed it of some of the things that happen with Native peoples? And I think many of our fellow citizens on reservations have every right to dissent from the acceptance of the stories that we've built into that. And that's a good kind of discussion to have. And I think the whole question of slavery and other kinds of issues are important to be debating about. And yet very often we end up with partisanship on both sides and a purified version of it on both sides. And we have a hard time really talking about it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that's what I feel is important is we need to be able to tell the truth about the story, the past stories. And, there's lots of conflicts these days about how do we teach the history of America in schools? Is it, America can do no wrong and everything's been great, or it's everything that America has ever done has been wrong? Seems to be the kind of the two sides, but we should be able to tell a truthful story about the good and the bad of American history.
Yeah, Jeff, I tell this in my book, but going through the 60s, I got a little irritated with super patriotism and felt a little alienated for quite a long time. But there were two events that surprised me about myself. And the one was being at the Hollywood Bowl for a concert a couple of days after 9/11. And the spotlight, it was getting dark, and the spotlight was up on the American flag, and the orchestra played the national anthem. And I started to cry. And the other event was when my wife and I were traveling from France when we went up to Normandy and just decided to stop off at Omaha Beach. And when we walked and suddenly saw thousands of graves with American flags, we both started to cry, Now, what was going on there was a love of a loyalty, just a sense of solidarity with people who died to make something possible for me and my family, my grandkids, and also the wounds of 9/11 and how we empathized with people in New York City. And I think it's natural that we did that a little more than we have with people in Paris when there have been acts of terrorism. I mean, we ought to be concerned about that. But there's something about this happened to us. This hurt us or this benefited us is a very important, it's a good thing to experience those things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it seems that the spread or impact of Christianity, of, living in Christ, his call to love enemies, it's this expansion, or, all the way back to Genesis, 1 and 2, the Imago Dei, this expansion of dignity to all human
Right.
people
Right.
is this expansive kind of affection, which we, should call love. And so Christians are called to keep pressing to expand that. But what I hear you saying is, but we also can't just deny or villainize the kind of natural, more spontaneous affection and love for the people we know, for the land we've been in.
Yeah.
And then symbolically, like you said, even though it's across the world, you're at gravesides and monuments of Americans, who died, elsewhere. And so there's this spontaneous affection. And so, because I've heard that too, is like, oh, that means you're a bad Christian if you cry over fallen American soldiers. It's like, well, that's not necessarily true. It just means I have like a spontaneous,
Yeah.
reaction. That's probably not bad. It can be bad, right? And so, and you mentioned that it can turn into tribalism. So we don't want to affirm tribalism, which is where that spontaneous affection becomes an exclusion toward the expansive, enemy love that Jesus directs us toward.
Right.
But we shouldn't just turn it off, right? That's
Sure.
almost impossible, probably.
And you said something very important. That is, we need to expand, but you can't expand something that isn't there, And it's just a fact. Aristotle, the philosopher, said, we first learned bonding with other human beings with mommy and daddy. You know, we feel connected to them. And then as we grow up a little bit, kinship expands to friendship. People who aren't kinfolk, but my friend Bobby at school, or the people in my scout troop. You know,
Hmm.
and Aristotle said it's important that we have those things, that we build on those things, but ultimately we need to walk into the public square where we see people who have different skin color than we have, people who have different orientations and different languages, but we see them as fellow human beings, and we extend our sense of bonding to people simply on the basis that they're human beings. Well, for us as Christians, that's the image of God.
Hmm.
I happen to have been, I mean, there's a long story to explain why, but I was in North Korea and went into a little village in North Korea. I'll never forget. We had brought food. I was with somebody who had provided absolutely necessary food to a village in North Korea where there had been landslides and their way of life had been destroyed. And as we left, a woman, a Korean mother, came with a 1-year-old boy and held him out and put him in my arms. And we couldn't speak, but she obviously wanted me to do something. And so what I did was I bowed my head and I prayed for that little boy.
Mm.
I prayed that someday he might know the Lord Jesus Christ, but also prayed that he flourish as a human being, that he loved family and the like. There was something powerful about that.
Mm.
And a couple of days later, the government took us to a church service, one of 4 legal church services in Pyongyang. And the choir sang, "What a friend we have in Jesus." And when they got to the verse and we had the translations in front of us, "Are we weak and heavy laden, burdened with a load of care? Jesus knows, Jesus knows." There was a young woman in the choir who started to cry. I could see the tears. And all of a sudden it hit me. I'm not here as a tourist.
Mm.
That's my sister in Christ. And that little boy in that village, he wasn't my brother in Christ, probably, although he could have been. But he was certainly a fellow human being. And those bondings are so important. But
Yeah.
at the same time, we have to build on that with patriotism, the love of our own country, and then extend that, expand that.
Mm. So if we are, you know, to be patriotic, we can be patriotic Christians. How then do Christians fit into the two-party system here in America?
Yeah, yeah. Well, for one thing, as Tim Keller has argued in a piece in the New York Times a year or so ago, we we probably don't fit very well into the two-party system.
Okay. Yeah. How
Our,
come?
our loyalties are to something higher than political parties, and
Mhm.
I must say, I voted both parties in my lifetime, and I try to look at the issues and uh, and 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 in the light of the scriptures, because we don't owe the Bible says we don't owe our absolute devotion to anything in the United States.
Right.
The apostles said in Jerusalem when they were forbidden to preach, they said we must obey God rather than man.
Mhm.
And so we need to keep thinking about what does it mean to obey God in the voting booth. And that means we need to look at issues, and we can argue with each other about that as well. And that's a good thing to do. I think we these days it's kind of hard to argue with each other,
Yes.
but it is good to argue. I make the point in my book that G.K. Chesterton, who was a great arguer, a great kind of a cranky Catholic at a lot of points, but he had a good friendship with George Bernard Shaw, who was anti-Christian.
Mm.
And people said to him, uh, how can you have a friendship with a non-Christian? You're a very Orthodox Catholic. And he said, because we know how to argue. He said, we don't quarrel. There's a lot of quarreling these days, but there is no, it takes a lot of good work to have a good argument.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
I think we have lost the ability to know how to argue and debate and give reasons and kind of
Yeah,
share those. And I know you talk quite a bit about civility in the public square over many decades, and it seems like the message has not caught on.
yeah,
Um, and what I find is that right now, you can't argue in good faith. I mean, you can try to argue in good faith, but people don't often receive it that way. They just assume that if you don't agree with them, and maybe this is an exaggeration, but if you don't agree with them, it means one of two things. You're either stupid or you're evil. You're
yeah,
either too dumb to follow the logic, or you're just a wicked person who's pursuing what's evil. And
yeah.
it's just like, well, can't two reasonable Jesus following people just kind of disagree? Because how we, biblical principles and how they become public policy, there's a pretty big interpretive gap there. And it just doesn't seem that there's the grace or the understanding that you could just disagree with them on that.
Absolutely. And this is why we need to have models for how it gets done.
Mhm.
And I think it's very important that there's a group called the Colossian Forum. They're very popular in Western Michigan, and but in other places as well. And they have actually made videos of people arguing together, Christian people arguing about same-sex relations, about abortion. They've taken the hot button issues and they have found people who are willing to really engage without getting angry and name calling. And we need that kind of education. And the church is a very important place, but it can't happen with 20-minute sermons on Sunday or even 45-minute sermons on Sunday. There have to be times when people get together and are willing to engage each other. And that is very difficult these days, but we've got to do it because I think the local church is a place where we can accomplish a lot of these things. We need a lot of help in that teaching ministry of the church.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so just to kind of summarize some of our points as we get to the end here, it sounds like you're arguing or suggesting that we could be patriotic Christians who um, who lean toward or kind of appreciate the nation and the peoplehood
Yeah,
that we're a part of, but that when it comes to the work of the state of politics, the two-party system, that Christians don't fit so easily into that, and
right.
they can have robust disagreements about the politics of the state while even, and even, disagree about exactly how to be patriotic, but
Yeah,
that we could be more patriotic on that side.
yeah, I agree. You put it well, Jeff.
Well,
Thanks.
I'm just summarizing what you said. So then the last question, and this is kind of a big question, and I just want to hear some of your thoughts. Is some people would say, well, it's not just that America is a nation state, but in some sense, we're akin to a world empire like Rome and other places who have expansive kind of reach all around the world, well beyond kind of the natural shores of where our affections kind of lie, and that there's been domination or injustice uh, caused by America. So how would you respond to this idea of being patriotic in the midst of like an empire?
Yeah,
How do Christians do that? How have they done that historically?
yeah. Thank you. And that's a very important issue because to whom much is given, much is required. And I do think that the United States does, the government has obligations beyond the boundaries of the nation and the defined boundaries of the state. We took that up in World War II when we realized that we had to go to war
Hmm.
uh, out of a sense of duty, among other things, to the Jewish people in Germany and elsewhere. We have obligations. Now, I think the Vietnam War wasn't the right kind of war. So we need to have arguments about what's the right thing to do. But it isn't isolationism. We do have obligations. We have to recognize that we have often uh, gone to war to grab territory from other nations and to extend our economic interests and the like. I think right now we're doing good things in supporting Ukraine
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. So, and that doesn't mean that our nation is, our empire deserves absolute devotion. No, we need to be a part of that wonderful dialogue, that wonderful conversation about how do we properly extend our influence and share with others what we have been blessed by God to possess in our own lives together.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks so much for being on today and just talking about your book. Again, the book is called How to Be a Patriotic Christian, How to Be a Patriotic Christian by Richard Mouw. He also talks about the passages of Jesus, where he talks about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. Also the beginning of Romans chapter 13, where it talks about being subject to the powers that God has instituted. So he talks about all these different types of things. He answers the question of should we have flags in our sanctuary? So he talks about all sorts of great things. But thank you so much for a little bit of time today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been great to talk to you and blessings. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.